Some time ago, Dr. Bart Ehrman had a debate with Daniel Wallace. Daniel Wallace is considered to be one of the most authoritative evangelical textual critics of our time, and I do place an emphasis on evangelical there. In their debate, they discussed the question as to whether or not the New Testament has been lost. Ehrman claimed that it has, and Wallace agreed that the New Testament documents have been lost, but he claimed that we could reconstruct what they said from the manuscript evidence. Ehrman said that he disagreed with this, that because of three problems that occur. The first problem is that we don't even know what it means to talk about the originals because we don't have the originals. So any talk of getting closer to reconstructing the originals is simply based on ignorance. We do not have the originals. The second problem he found was that there are no early manuscripts. Ehrman cites the fact that we have about 5,500 manuscripts. The problem is not the number, says Ehrman. The problem is the ages, or the dates associated with these manuscripts. For example, there are no manuscripts from the 1st century. We don't have any manuscripts from the time of Christ. The earliest manuscripts that we have date to 150 years after the time of Christ. 150 years after the time that Christ was said to live. And this is only a small little scrap called P52. Ehrman asked the question, how many complete manuscripts do we have from the 2nd or 3rd century? Answer, 0. We don't have any. He said that 94% of the manuscripts that we have come from the 9th century. So think about this for a second. That means that the majority of the evidence that these textual critics are pointing to comes 900 years after the time of Christ. Just let that sink in. 900 years after the time of Christ. Do we want to argue that these manuscripts were unbiased? That as they were translated and copied and transmitted, that bias was not injected into them for their own particular theological purposes? So Ehrman says that there's no early manuscripts. They just do not exist. What I find interesting about this is that for many, many years, Christian apologists used to cite this number. We have 5,000 plus manuscripts that give a testimony to the reliability of the New Testament. But ladies and gentlemen, they were not referencing the quality of these manuscripts, but the quantity of these manuscripts. It's a kind of trick to persuade the listener, the uncritical listener, that the number alone guarantees the accuracy and the preservation. Apologists got away with this for a long time, and this is to their discredit. Only after Ehrman has come on the scene have they finally started to confess to the actual reality of the nature of this evidence. Now the conversation begins to change. Instead of just hearing this blank number that we have 5,500 manuscripts backing up the reliability of the New Testament, now we find a new conversation. We find the reality that none of these manuscripts date to the 1st century, that they don't even date to the 3rd century, 300 years after Christ, we have no complete manuscripts of the New Testament. 94% of the manuscript evidence comes 900 years after the time of Christ. Why did Christian apologists and textual critics, evangelical textual critics, cite the quantity? Because they have been trying to prey on people's ignorance for years. That is what all apologists do. They seek to prey on people's ignorance so they can indoctrinate them into their religion. The third problem that Ehrman finds with the idea of being able to reconstruct the original New Testament is that scholars can't agree. In other words, out of these 5,500 manuscripts we have, when we go to extract one final document from this body of work, scholars are not uniform as to what should be extracted, as to what should qualify as actually being a consistent uniformity based on these manuscripts. This is a very serious problem. But let us pose a thought experiment. Let's assume that for the last 100 years, that every scholar that has ever examined these 5,500 manuscripts, that all these scholars came to the exact same conclusions, that we have only produced, out of these 5,500, all scholars produced one uniform text. That the wording of that text was all the same, that everybody agreed with 100% certainty. The question would still arise. Does this product that these scholars have produced represent what was actually said in the originals? The answer is we have no way to tell. The claim that we can reconstruct what the New Testament said is entirely based on the assumption that what is deduced from these manuscripts qualifies as an accurate representation of what the original said. But we have absolutely no way of being able to know this because, as Daniel Wallace agrees, the New Testament original documents have been lost.
Is the original New Testament lost? If the question means, are the original New Testament documents lost, then yes, of course they are.
Now what's interesting is that Wallace is still making bold claims as to being able to reproduce what the original New Testament said. In a later document that he published after Ehrman and him had a debate, he says the following. He says, "I have never said in our debates that we are absolutely certain of the wording of the text of the New Testament. So I would agree with Ehrman that we really don't have any way to know for sure. But that's a far cry from saying that we don't have probability on our side." This is Wallace's claim, that he can ultimately produce a probability as to whether or not we can accurately reproduce the original New Testament. And the question to Wallace is, how can he do this when he admits that we don't have the originals?
Is the original New Testament lost? If the question means, are the original New Testament documents lost, then yes, of course they are.
He seems to be assuming that the product that is created from these 5,500 manuscripts is an accurate representation of originals that he has never seen. So if he is able to produce a probability based on this 5,500 number, how does he know that that probability percentage corresponds to the actual originals. Very important what Ehrman said in response to Wallace on this point. The further we go back in examining the manuscript evidence, the more discrepancies we find. In other words, when we look at the manuscripts we have from the 9th century, the further back in time we go, getting closer and closer to the life of Jesus, the more variation we find in the manuscripts. So how is it possible for Wallace to be able to claim that he can produce a probability of reproduction when the evidence is that there is a greater variation going back in time? That in fact, the evidence that we find demonstrates that the scribes were actually not careful in handling or transmitting the text. And yet Wallace is still persisting in making the claim. I believe he makes the claim because it works on people who are impressed with quantity alone and who don't actually know how to think about what the claim is, saying that he can produce a probability. That is Wallace's claim. What Ehrman's claim is that Ehrman cannot say anything when it comes to saying these are reproductions of the originals. The evidence does not permit that because we don't have the originals. So the claim that we have reproduced the originals is simply not tenable given the evidence. And most importantly, it's actually contradicted by the evidence because of what Ehrman says. The further back in time we go, the more variation we find. How is it that Wallace overcomes this claim? If Wallace has in fact produced a probability manifesting and demonstrating reproduction of the original New Testament, he needs to make it known, because so far the only thing he is doing is making an empty assertion.